You need to take down your security cameras. Now." Karen's voice was cold and final, like an iron fist wrapped in velvet. The words hung in the air like a challenge. I stared at her, blinking in disbelief, as she stood there with her arms crossed in front of my front door, a smug smile playing on her lips. I had seen her around, of course. Karen, the HOA president, the self-appointed ruler of our little suburban kingdom. She wasn't happy unless she could make everyone in the neighborhood follow her version of perfection. But this was the last straw. I had installed security cameras for a reason, because my house had been broken into 3 times in the last 6 months. Was I supposed to just sit back and let that happen again? Of course not. And yet, here was Karen demanding I rip them down, simply because they didn't fit her idea of what our street should look like. It was ridiculous. The cameras were discreet, nothing more than small black spheres that barely stood out against the corners of my house. But to her, they were a violation of the community aesthetic. I crossed my arms, trying to hide the irritation building in my chest. You've got to be kidding me, Karen. My cameras are there to keep me safe. What is this? Some power play? She didn't blink. The HOA has spoken. You have 14 days to remove them, or we'll take action. I could feel my blood boiling. Who did she think she was? She wasn't some all-powerful dictator. This wasn't her kingdom. This was my home. I closed the door in her face, my mind racing. Karen was used to getting her way, but this time, she was crossing a line. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not without a fight. I pulled out my phone and dialed my friend, Lisa, hoping she could give me some advice. Lisa was always the level-headed one, the one who knew how to handle people like Karen. She picked up after the first ring. Hey, what's going on? Karen's at my door, telling me to take down my security cameras. I said, my voice shaking with anger. She says they're violating HOA rules. Can you believe that? There was a long pause on the other end. Then, Lisa's voice came back, calm and collected. You need to stand your ground. Don't let her push you around. You have every right to protect yourself. And if she keeps pushing, I'll be there to help you fight it. Her words gave me a bit of comfort, but I knew this wasn't going to be easy. Karen had always been a problem, but this was personal. As I hung up the phone, I glanced out of the window. I could see Karen standing across the street, her eyes narrowed, watching me like she was waiting for me to make my next move. What she didn't know was that her move wasn't just wrong. It was about to make her the biggest target in the neighborhood. And soon, she'd learn that messing with me was the biggest mistake of her life. The moment I closed the door, I could feel my heart racing. Karen's words echoed in my mind, each one sending a chill down my spine. She wasn't just another HOA president trying to enforce rules. She was making this personal. I stood by the window, watching her walk back to her house, her heels clicking against the pavement, an air of smug satisfaction surrounding her. She thought she had won, but I wasn't going to let this slide. Not after everything that had happened. The break-ins, the feeling of constantly being unsafe in my own home. It had taken a toll on me. My security cameras weren't just a precaution. They were a lifeline. I had been living in fear for too long, and now, this woman was trying to take that away from me. I wasn't about to let her win. I grabbed my phone and started looking up HOA regulations, desperately searching for anything that could help me fight this. The rules were vague, nothing concrete that said I couldn't have cameras for security. I pulled up the city's zoning laws, hoping they might have something more specific. But everything I found pointed to one thing. I was well within my rights to protect my property. That knowledge gave me a small sense of relief, but it wasn't enough. Karen was going to be relentless, and I knew I had to be ready for whatever she threw at me. I decided to take action. First, I gathered all the documents I had, from the installation of my cameras to the permits and receipts from the security company. I wasn't just going to let her bully me into submission. I would make sure I had everything in place in case I needed to take legal action. It was then that I realized I needed to get other people involved to make sure it wasn't just me against her. I spent the next few days talking to my neighbors, letting them know what Karen was doing and how it was affecting me. At first, some were hesitant to get involved. Karen had that kind of power over the neighborhood, where people were too scared to speak up against her. But as I explained what was happening, as I showed them the notice and the emails from the HOA, the tide started to turn. Slowly but surely, people began to speak out. Some of them had their own stories of Karen's overreach, her tendency to bully anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of what the neighborhood should look like. It wasn't long before word spread, and suddenly, Karen's little war on security cameras wasn't just about me. It became a neighborhood issue. Neighbors who had been quiet for so long now found their voices. The more I talked, the more I realized just how deep Karen's influence ran. She wasn't just the HOA president. She had built her own little empire. She controlled everything from the streetlights to the paint colors, and if anyone stepped out of line, she made sure they paid. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How could one person have so much power over everyone? It wasn't right, and I was done letting her control me, my home, and my safety. But even as I plotted my next move, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't the only one who had crossed a line. I had a sinking suspicion that something far worse was going to happen, and it would be because of her meddling. Then the unthinkable happened. I was at home one evening, just finishing up dinner when my phone buzzed. It was a news alert, a breaking story. I swiped open the notification and nearly dropped my phone. The home of Senator Mark Henderson had been broken into. The police were on the scene, and there were reports of valuables being stolen. Everything from electronics to important documents. My stomach dropped. Senator Henderson lived 2 streets over. I had never spoken to him, but I had seen him around. His house was big, almost too big for the neighborhood, but it wasn't the size of his home that caught my attention. It was his security system. His house was covered in cameras, just like mine. The fact that a high-profile politician like him had been targeted in such a bold way, it didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit together. I immediately started scrolling through the local news reports, trying to gather as much information as I could. It wasn't just the theft that bothered me, it was the timing. The break-in had happened the night after Karen had come to my door with her ridiculous demand to take down my cameras. The thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. What if the thieves were targeting people like us, people with visible security systems? What if Karen's insistence on removing my cameras wasn't about aesthetics at all? What if she was inadvertently putting everyone at risk? My phone buzzed again, but this time it was a text from Lisa. I just saw the news about the senator's house. Did you hear about it? What do you think it means? I typed back quickly. I think Karen's making a huge mistake. It's not just about me anymore. We're all in danger, and she's making it worse. I need to do something before it's too late. I wasn't just upset anymore. I was scared. Not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood. Karen's obsession with control was now putting lives at risk. And the worst part? I knew that the break-in at the senator's house was just the beginning. If Karen wasn't stopped, the entire neighborhood could end up vulnerable to the same fate. It wasn't long before the media picked up the story. As the news spread about the senator's break-in, more and more people started questioning their own safety. Was Karen's HOA really protecting us? Or was she creating an environment that made us more vulnerable? The questions started to pile up, and the pressure was mounting on Karen to answer them. But she wasn't the type to back down, and I knew that the next few days were going to be even more intense. But what Karen didn't know was that she had just made a critical mistake. By forcing me to take down my security cameras, she had stirred up something much bigger than she realized. And now, the entire neighborhood was about to find out what happens when you try to take control over something you don't fully understand. As the days passed, the tension in the neighborhood grew thicker. The senator's break-in had sparked more concern than anyone could have anticipated. Neighbors who had once stayed silent, afraid of crossing Karen, now openly discussed the rising crime and the role the HOA had in creating an unsafe environment. What was once a small issue about a few security cameras had now snowballed into a full-blown neighborhood crisis. People were beginning to question Karen's motives, her authority, and the true cost of her so-called community standards. I kept an eye on my front yard, waiting for the inevitable. Karen had warned me that there would be consequences if I didn't comply with her demands. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The more I thought about the senator's break-in, the more I realized that Karen's obsession with control was putting us all in danger. My cameras weren't just a precaution for me anymore. They had become a symbol of resistance. If I backed down now, I would be letting her win. Worse, I will be sending a message that it was okay for someone like Karen to dictate the safety of the entire neighborhood. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the atmosphere was electric. I could sense that something big was going to happen. More and more neighbors had started showing up at meetings, their faces tense with frustration. People who had previously feared Karen's authority were now standing up, questioning her decisions and demanding change. The board members, who had always followed Karen's lead without question, were growing visibly uncomfortable. It was clear they were beginning to realize that their positions of power were no longer secure. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early, hoping to get a seat at the front. As I walked into the community center, I could already see the tension in the room. Neighbors were whispering among themselves, sharing their concerns about the recent break-ins and the growing feeling that the HOA's rules were more about control than about protecting anyone's interests. Karen was at the front of the room, holding her usual position of power. She smiled when she saw me walk in, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know they have the upper hand. She was about to make her move, but I was ready. The meeting began with Karen going over the usual agenda. She spoke about property values, lawn maintenance, and various other trivial issues. But when she brought up the security cameras, the room fell silent. I stood up, the words already forming in my mind, and I addressed the room. I explained how my cameras weren't just about monitoring the outside of my home. I talked about the break-ins, the feeling of constant unease, and a need for security in a world where crime was rising. I reminded everyone that we were a community, not just a collection of houses, and that it was time to stand up to the real threats, the ones that were coming from within. Karen's face turned red as I spoke. She tried to interrupt, but the room wasn't having it. Neighbors who had previously sat on the sidelines were now speaking up, offering their support. They were finally realizing that Karen wasn't the protector of the community she claimed to be. She was a bully who thrived on fear. The more I spoke, the more the mood in the room shifted. People started asking questions, demanding answers. How could Karen justify forcing me to take down my cameras when the senator's house had just been robbed? Why had she been so adamant about enforcing rules that made us all more vulnerable? Karen tried to steer the conversation back to her agenda, but it was too late. The cracks were already showing. I could feel the power shifting. Karen was no longer in control. The board members, who had always backed her, were starting to squirm in their seats. They couldn't ignore the obvious truth. The HOA was failing the community. As the room grew more restless, I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. Karen's face was now a mask of fury. She tried to regain control, but her words fell on deaf ears. The more she argued, the more people pushed back. Finally, one of the board members, a man named Mr. Davis, stood up. He had always been one of Karen's most loyal supporters, but today, he spoke with a sense of newfound resolve. "I think it's time we took a hard look at how things are being run around here," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe we need to reconsider some of these policies. Maybe we've been too focused on rules and not enough on safety." It was a moment that took everyone by surprise. Mr. Davis had just thrown Karen under the bus. The room erupted into applause. The power dynamics had completely shifted. Karen's reign of terror was over, and she knew it. Her once unshakable confidence was now replaced with panic. She tried to argue, but the more she spoke, the more she sounded desperate. Then, something even more unexpected happened. A local reporter, who had been quietly observing the meeting from the back of the room, stepped forward. She introduced herself and asked if she could speak with me after the meeting. I was taken aback at first, but she explained that the story about the senator's break-in had already gone viral, and she was interested in how the HOA's actions were contributing to the growing tension in the neighborhood. As the meeting came to a close, I was swarmed by neighbors, all eager to share their thoughts, offer support, and express their frustration with the way things have been run. For the first time in a long while, it felt like we were truly a community. People who cared for each other, who had each other's backs. Karen, defeated and humiliated, stormed out of the room. Her influence had crumbled, and with it, the fear she had instilled in so many of us. But the battle wasn't over yet. The real fight was just beginning. It was time to take the next step and make sure something like this never happened again. The neighbors who had once stayed silent were now ready to stand together, and we were going to make sure that Karen's reign of terror was over for good.